Yes, thank you very much. All right, now we'll move on to the Deputy Director's report for the North Coast District. And who will be doing?
Hello.
Hello.
I'll be doing it today. Unfortunately, Director Gray came down with an illness, so.
No, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
But we're very happy to have you here in the North Coast, so thanks for being here. Item 10 is the Deputy Director's report for the North Coast District, which includes 4 waivers, 5 immaterial amendments, and 1 CDP time extension. Staff is not aware of any opposition on these matters, and we're asking whether 3 or more commissioners object to this item, and we're available for questions.
All right, are there any speakers?
We just have one available for questions.
All right, did 3 or more commissioners object to an item on the Deputy Director's report? All right, seeing none, the commission concurs, and we will move on to the next item, which is?
The next item is item 10A. It's within the Deputy Director's report, and we have a presentation from Caltrans. I'm going to turn this over to our Transportation Program Analyst, Abigail Strickland, to give the introduction and presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair Hart, commissioners, and members of the public. The purpose of today's briefing is related to conditions imposed by the Commission and its approval of a coastal development permit for various safety improvements for the 6-mile-long Highway 101 corridor between Eureka and Arcata in Humboldt County. When this stretch of highway was created decades before the Coastal Act was enacted, it cut across Humboldt Bay tidelands and today stretches between the bay and diked former tidelands. Lands adjacent to the corridor are currently used for farming, open space, and in some areas, commercial, residential, industrial, and public facilities uses. One of the conditions imposed by the Commission requires Caltrans to develop a comprehensive sea level rise adaptation plan for this highway corridor by the end of 2025. A second condition requires Caltrans to monitor flooding and tidal elevations in the highly vulnerable corridor and to present this monitoring and a progress report on the adaptation plan to the Commission. We believe that Caltrans has made some good progress, though much work remains to be done. We do want to highlight that since the Commission imposed these requirements 5 years ago, there's been a significant shift within Caltrans District 1 organization to focus on sea level rise planning, including the creation of a brand new agency branch dedicated to climate change adaptation and the establishment of a technical advisory committee. District 1 was one of the first statewide to create such a dedicated branch. One long-term option Caltrans is considering is a hybrid approach to adaptation that involves a range of strategies, including options for raising the highway with bridges in key areas to restore connectivity to the Bay of Tidal Sloughs and marshlands east of the highway. But there are many challenges with this type of approach, and there's still a lot more planning and analysis to be done, as you'll hear about. So with that, we'd like to introduce Clancy, who is a senior specialist in the climate change adaptation branch of District 1, where he's been working since its inception and is largely responsible for building up the program to what it is today.
Thank you for having me. My name is Clancy DeSmit, Senior Specialist with the Climate Adaptation Branch, Caltrans. I'm here to give you an update on the Comprehensive Adaptation and Implementation Plan for the Eureka-Arcata corridor. The Eureka-Arcata, next slide, please. The Eureka-Arcata corridor, shown here, consists of 5 component projects, including tide gate replacement, an undercrossing, acceleration and deceleration lanes, cable median barrier, and some bridge replacement. The Humboldt Bay Trail, which is an important part of the Great Redwood Trail, is shown here in blue. The trail will be complete in 2024, and there's still lots of work to do, lots of decades of planning. The corridor is critical because it is a primary transportation hub in Humboldt County. There are few alternate routes available. The corridor contains utility lines, recreational amenities, business and residential properties. Also, it is vulnerable given its proximity to Humboldt Bay. There's often only a few feet of freeboard. In some spots, the road elevation is as high as 12 feet and in other as low as 10. Next slide, please. As Abby discussed, there are 2 climate change related conditions, special conditions. One is the long-term monitoring. The second condition, and more importantly, is the Comprehensive Adaptation and Implementation Plan. The picture shown here is from overtopping that happened in winter of 2005, which was a result of king tides and storm surge. Next slide, please. So as Abby also mentioned, the special conditions were the impetus for the establishment of the Climate Change Adaptation Branch. As a result, the district began a strong effort to increase awareness and public participation with community groups, coordination with local, state, federal, and tribal agencies. Also, we entered into a contract with Cal Poly Humboldt and local experts to complete technical studies on the corridor, which will help Caltrans determine the best solution and long-term plan for the Eureka-Arcata corridor. Next slide, please. Sometimes I feel like the person in this cartoon. So as we mentioned before, there are two special conditions. One was monitoring and the other one is long-term planning. And another requirement is that we give an annual update to the commission. It's been since July 2022 since we've been here, so apologies for the delay. Next slide, please. As part of our reporting, we document the maximum monthly sea level yearly. Mean sea level for each reporting year is calculated using NOAA's tides and currents page. We also document any road closures due to flooding impacts and other coastal hazards to the corridor during the reporting period. And we update the progress on the CAIP. And finally, all of these reports are available publicly on our climate change website, which is called northcoastclimateaction.org. Next slide, please. So this slide's pretty busy. Basically, the takeaway here is that there's been no flooding during the reporting period for the 5 years. The y-axis shows the water elevation in terms of feet over the reporting period. The x-axis shows the north spit tide gauge in months. And so, like I said, there were no flooding events or storm surge events in the reporting period. However, the highest reported water elevation of 8.96 was observed in 12/27/2023. And the bar graph on the far right shows the storm surge event in 2005, which was approximately 9.55 feet. This elevation has not been observed since 2005. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We also monitor king tides using the 10 reference photo locations seen here. Caltrans staff documents king tide conditions from established reference points every winter. The green arrow indicates 2 locations I'll show you on the next slide. So on the left, you'll see the Jacoby Creek Bridge replacement, which was part of the Eureka-Arcata Improvement Project. The next picture shows the king tides from 2022 to 2024 in that same location. And of note is the most recent king tides did not coincide with a major storm event. However, there was a storm on January 13th and we had favorable winds. So the winds were blowing in another direction. So we didn't suffer any critical infrastructure impacts. Next slide, please. So this picture shows the Humboldt Bay Trail. This is not a Caltrans facility. The Bay Trail construction along the corridor has commenced and has stopped erosion of the railroad bed near the California Redwood Company. And it should be noted that it's not our facility. You can see the erosion progressing in 2022 and 2023. It's a welcome sight after decades of planning for this new trail to see a positive sign along Humboldt Bay. Also, the Humboldt Bay Trail improves resilience because it's being built upon the railroad prism, which will give us further protection from sea level rise. Next slide. Special condition 2 is the most important component that builds upon the monitoring and reporting of the annual report. Next slide. So here's a timeline of our progress to date and our plans moving forward. As you know, the CDP was issued in 2019. The information along the bottom of the timeline shows our monitoring and compliance with special condition 2. On the top of the timeline, you'll see our efforts to complete the CAIP as required by the special condition. Next slide. Now I'll focus more on the CAIP. The last update to the commission, as I said, was July 2022. However, this timeline doesn't accurately reflect the numerous meetings we've had with commission staff and other local agencies. A lot has happened since the last update. First, we spent 2 years planning public outreach and assessing our needs for a long-term plan. We determined that we needed more expertise, local expertise, to assist us with technical studies. It took more than a year to finalize the contract with Cal Poly Humboldt through the procurement process. And currently we're working with Cal Poly and their team of experts who are hydrologists, geomorphologists, and seismic hazard experts. And we've established a technical advisory committee, which consists of stakeholders and local experts with representation from Humboldt County, the cities of Eureka and Arcata, coastal staff, and the Wiyot tribe. Next slide, please. So Cal Poly Humboldt's work is sort of twofold. They have a couple of tasks, and they're going to be a significant contributor to the CAIP. The first task will be to assess existing and anticipated conditions, including defining existing and projected hydrologic hazards, defining existing geologic hazards, and identifying potential impacted land use and infrastructure impacts. And the second task will be to analyze those impacts and help us develop alternatives. At the conclusion of their work, they will help us review conceptual designs, but I want to reiterate that Caltrans is in charge of the process and will ultimately decide what the plan is going forward, and we know that's our responsibility. Next slide, please. As outlined in the special conditions, Caltrans is exploring several adaptation strategies, from realignment to protect to accommodate, and the most promising, the hybrid strategy. The protect is the dashed yellow line, accommodate is the green dashed line, realignment or retreat is shown in red. The hybrid strategy is shown in light blue. At this time, all options remain on the table, including minor realignments, and the approach is also modular. Assuming the hybrid approach maintains a similar alignment, the number of parcels affected could range from 25 to over 100. Anticipated cost remains unspecified, and there is a large variation with the construction costs, and we hope to figure that out before we submit the final CAIP. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. One more. For conceptual purposes only, we have included some pictures to illustrate what a hybrid approach could entail. The hybrid approach aims to be cost-effective and the least environmentally damaging alternative. By using a combination of adaptation strategies, the plan could enhance coastal access and improve surrounding habitat quality. If funding becomes available, a hybrid strategy would increase resiliency and enhance the surrounding area. Next slide, please. Focusing on the environmental benefits of the hybrid approach. For example, if tide gates are removed and replaced with bridges or bottomless culverts with large capacity, Caltrans could effectively restore hydraulic conditions of the various sloughs back to the bay. It's important to keep in mind that much of the land to the east of the corridor is diked former tidelands. Once connectivity is restored, the community could recreate a network of trails, enhance recreational opportunities, and provide additional resilience for sea level rise. Next slide, please. So in summary, we've done a lot and we still have a lot to go. We've established a technical advisory committee. We have a public engagement plan. We're maintaining a website, public-facing website. We're active participants in the Sea Level Rise Institute of Cal Poly Humboldt. We did a presentation at the Humboldt Bay Symposium this last year, and we have monthly meetings with Humboldt County to review sea level rise projects. We are also coordinating with local governments on LCP updates and have regular meetings with North Coast staff, and there will be future public meetings for the CAIP. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll take questions.
All right, does that complete your presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Are there members of the public that'd like to speak on this?
There are no additional speakers for this item.
Okay, bring it back to the commission. Commissioner Wilson?
I just want to thank you for the presentation. I'm glad we're getting this far. It's been a long road, and I appreciate that this commission working with Caltrans and during the approval of the moving forward the projects improvements there really requested and got the collaboration on the Humboldt Bay Trail, which is something we really were looking forward to, and I think we're almost there. We're almost gonna be done with that. So I just want to appreciate that. I was actually present on that storm in 2005 on the highway there. Not seen in that photo, but just beyond is where one of the billboards blew onto the highway during that. So it wasn't just, I mean, there was high winds as well, which were driving those elevated surge impacts. So, but I think we're prone to see more of that. And I think, as mentioned before in other presentations, that part of the bay is the fastest sea level rise in the state of California. So, due to tectonic lowering of the earth there. So anyways, I just want to thank you so much for this presentation. I'm sure we're going to have more interaction, and I'm also thankful that we're bringing in Cal Poly to assist with this. So it's that analysis and that participation will be more community oriented. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Commissioner, I'm sorry, did you have a response?
No, I just,
Great. Commissioner Williams?
All right, thank you. Just wanted to echo Commissioner Wilson's comments there, and thank you, Mr. Dismit, for coming up here in District 1's update. I appreciate that. I do have a question with regard to just as far as the community outreach and whatnot. I don't believe I saw exactly who's involved in the TAC, and I just was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
sure. Currently, we have members of the cities of Eureka, Arcata, Humboldt County. I believe there's even one member from a private agency, GHD, and then we have a member of the Wiat tribe, Adam Cantor.
All
And
right,
I can get you that list if you'd like.
Vice Chair Escalante. And then Commissioner Cook.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Actually, I found it very exciting because it took me back to that meeting, very hard conversations about really how quickly we were going to adapt. And I'm sure I would love to hear what former Commissioner Amanzada's thoughts would be about that map. I think some of those buffers and those barriers are remarkable, and we do look forward. I remember taking that left turn in Semiola towards the car dealership. Is it the car dealerships?
Yeah.
That's where I service my cars, and I held my breath. That turn is one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. I totally, after that, I was like, I was right about my vote. So I do appreciate you guys doing this and the path forward and the collaborations with the locals. I think that it's a perfect way to move forward. And when we talk about this tourism-based economy, I know, for Eureka-Arcata, there's a lot more going on. And for us up here, we think of Eureka as the big city now. When I need to go to Costco, I go to the big city. So it's a very important, thoroughfare for this entire region. And obviously getting ready for this impending future that we have is great. And in moving also forward with trails and opening up some of the slots, I think that will also enable some advancement to what the public access and some of this, tourism potential in that particular area. Every time I kind of drive by it, I wish I could do it slower so I could look at just, the whole bay. So I look forward to that vision. So thank you. And I love Caltrans District 1. You guys keep these roads beautiful. So.
Well, once the trails and you can take a slower ride along the bay.
Commissioner Kunkel?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Hart. First, just thrilled to hear about the dedicated climate branch in District 1. That's very exciting. And the website, which I wrote down, I just want to repeat for people too. It was northcoastclimateaction.org with all those resources and data. That's just fantastic. I think that I'm speaking to the choir here, but we just have this really short window of time to act when it comes to climate and sea level rise. The controller is always thinking about the fiscal impact to taxpayers. The longer we take, the more expensive it is, the larger the impact to taxpayers. I see your timeline, and of course, the CDP that was approved included the contingency that that adaptation plan was complete by December 2025.
Correct.
And that looks like it was right on your timeline. Even with all the progress that you've achieved, I still see a lot to be done. And I'm just curious, how confident do you feel in meeting that timeline?
I feel pretty confident. The biggest confidence I have is that, for 3 years, it was only me in the climate change branch, and now there are 3
Yeah.
people. So we have a hydrologist and we have a supervising environmental scientist. So Some of the other duties that were spread out that I had to do, including the comprehensive plan, are spread out amongst 3 people now. So we're a little bit more nimble, I would say. So I feel pretty good about it. There's still a lot of work to do. That contract with Cal Poly took a long time. And but yeah, I feel pretty good about it.
Understood. That-
And we'll keep
that
the
feels-
commission and staff up to date.
Okay, great. And then just expanding on Commissioner Williams, I was happy to see the partnerships, the technical advisory committee, including Adam Cantor, member of the the Wiyot tribe. Can you just tell me more about the public outreach that you've completed and you have planned? And I'm specifically thinking about engagement with tribes, with other tribes, with low income and designated disadvantaged communities, especially around that segment of 101. I know there's a large disadvantaged community in that area. What do you have planned and what's already been completed?
So we have a planning and public engagement contract with MIG, which is a private company that helps with facilitation and public engagement. And so we have a plan that we developed in 2021. Because of the progress was a little bit slowed over the interim period. We haven't had as many public meetings, but we had a couple of public meetings. I've given presentations to Cal Poly, to Ollie, and we had one public meeting where we had engagement with folks from Jacobs Avenue. And once we have some more deliverables from the Cal Poly technical studies, we're going to start robustly meeting with various stakeholders, disadvantaged communities, agencies, and other interested persons. So in the next year, we're going to have to ramp it up.
Okay.
And I
That's
can
promising.
share the public engagement plan with the commission.
I would
um,
really appreciate that. Absolutely. I
Yeah,
think
that'd be great.
that we all agree. I mean, we just want that that engagement to be meaningful, for that we're ensuring that these people's voices are actually being heard and that it's actually happening too.
I
That's
made-
all I have. I
made a
really
note.
appreciate the update. Thank you.
Of course.
All right, any other commissioner comments? Commissioner Wilson?
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that this project is not in isolation in terms of sea level rise, that you have, one of the commissioners asked me about what the line of retreat, and what that really meant, and whether or not the alignment is anywhere close to where it is today. There will be other elements of Humboldt Bay that will be in retreat, whether or not this remains in its location. So, including, commercial zones that are at the Jacobs Avenue is a huge commercial area, which currently sits below sea level during high tides and has, and doesn't, the levee that services that is owned by each individual property owner, meaning that it has no coordinated defense in terms of sea level rise. Not just that, but then every other piece of property in that whole Bay region, sub-region. So I do what I just want to say is, like, I appreciate that you're both having to analyze this from just the service of just this one infrastructural issue in the context of both public and private matrix of uses that will be impacted by sea level rise. So that was all I wanted to point out for my commission's edification. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments? Thank you so much. I'd just like to say I'm a director of the Great Redwood Trail Agency. And when we talk about the parts of the trail that have been completed or in construction, which of course everyone always wants to know, thank goodness that we have the work that's going on up here, incorporating, of course, all your sea level rise work, but in creating a trail system that hopefully one day will go from bay to bay, from the San Francisco Bay all the way up to the Humboldt Bay. So it's very exciting. And thank you for all of your work. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I'd like to say one last thing.
Of course.
Is that if we end up having to do some sort of causeway or some sort of, segmented piece of like that, we're going to try to figure out ways to protect the trail too. If it
That would be
becomes
great.
mandated.
Be San Francisco Bay to Humboldt Bay minus the, no, we don't want to have that. So, all right, thank you. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. All right, that was informational item. So now we'll move on to the coastal permit applications under item 11, beginning with item 11A, Humboldt Bay Harbor District as the applicant. This is the Master Water Intakes Project, and you will be presenting that as well.
Yes. Yes, item 11A is a permit application from the Harbor District, as you mentioned, for a project referred to as the Humboldt Bay Master Water Intakes Project. And I will be tag teaming this presentation today with Tom Lester, Senior Environmental Scientist in the Commission's Energy and Ocean Resources Unit, who's online with us today. Oh, there's the slides. Okay, next slide, please. The project is located on Humboldt Bay in the Samoa area west of the city of Eureka on property owned by the Harbor District. There are two existing industrial docks on the subject site, one called Red Tank Dock and the other is the main dock associated with Redwood Marine Terminal 2, shown as RMT2 on this slide. These two docks are associated with adjoining lands that are planned and zoned for coastal dependent industrial uses under the Humboldt County Certified LCP. Next slide. The proposed project is related to two other projects that have recently come before the Coastal Commission. In December of last year, the Commission considered appeals of the county's decision to grant a permit with conditions to Nordic Aquafarms to demolish the remnants of the former pulp mill that was historically located at RMT2 and to redevelop the site with a land-based aquaculture facility. The facility would cultivate yellowtail kingfish and would produce head-on gutted fish and fillets for delivery to regional markets. The Nordic project proposes to use approximately 10 million gallons per day of salt water proposed for extraction from Humboldt Bay by the Harbor District under the permit application that is before you today. In considering the appeals in December, the Commission found that the appeals did not present a substantial issue with respect to the grounds on which the appeals were filed and declined to take jurisdiction over the county's CDP, which is now effective. Another related permit is a CDP approved by the Commission last November from Nordic, proposing to discharge approximately 10 million gallons per day of treated wastewater effluent from the aquaculture facility via the existing marine outfall pipeline that historically served the pulp mill and which terminates 1.5 miles offshore. Next slide, please. So the scope of this CDP application has 4 main components listed here: the seawater intake system, water pipeline installation, extraction and use of seawater, and mitigation for marine resource impacts. We'll touch briefly on each. Next slide. This slide shows the existing water intake systems at each of the docks, with the intake system at Red Tank Dock shown in the 2 images on the left, and the existing system at RMT2 shown in the 3 other photos. As you can glean from these photos, the existing intake structures, which are referred to as sea chests, consist of deteriorated wood and concrete. Neither system has been used since at least 2008, which is when the pulp mill shut down. The Harbor District proposes to repair and redevelop each intake system by sealing cracks and installing new screens, pumps, and connecting pipeline infrastructure. The 2 intakes would be operated and managed as a single system, with both feeding into a common manifold and distribution system. The Harbor District would meter water to tenants engaging in coastal dependent uses on its RMT2 property, including Nordic. Next slide. A portion of the proposed water distribution system is shown on this slide. The pipeline route around RMT2 around the dock is shown in orange. Pipelines would be installed via trenching and excavation. There would be about 4,600 feet of trenching, with trenches up to 19 feet wide and 5 feet deep. Now I will turn it over to Tom to discuss the project components involving the extraction and use of seawater and measures proposed to reduce impacts to marine resources.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Good afternoon, Chair Hart and Commissioners. Could I have the next slide, please? As you just heard, a key aspect of this project is the proposed withdrawal of water from Humboldt Bay. This would be done in 3 phases, as shown on this slide, starting with an initial withdrawal of just over 5 million gallons a day, and then ramping up to the full proposed amount of about 12 million gallons a day over subsequent years. Withdrawing seawater for purposes of this project also creates a substantial adverse impact to marine life. Next slide, please. Removing this water from the bay also removes part of the bay's productivity in the form of the fish eggs, larvae, and other small planktonic organisms in the water that serve as the base of the bay's food web. This adverse effect is known as entrainment, which happens when these small organisms are drawn into an intake and killed. For this project, the full proposed water withdrawal would result in a loss of organisms equal to those produced each year in about 28.5 acres of the bay's various habitat types. I want to provide you some background and detail on how we determine that loss, so I hope you'll bear with me for a few moments. Next slide, please. To allow the use of open water intakes such as these, staff first had to determine whether there were feasible alternatives that would have less of an environmental impact. For example, could the district construct new subsurface intakes which would entirely avoid entrainment? For this project, those types of alternative intakes are not feasible, primarily due to the types of underlying substrates at or near the project location. If open water intakes are to be used, we then look into how to reduce the impacts on marine life. In this case, the district has proposed installing new screens known as cylindrical wedge wire screens on the intakes. The district would operate the intakes at low intake velocities, which allows larger marine life to avoid being killed or injured by being trapped against the screens. The district screens would also have a mesh size of 1 millimeter or less, which will prevent larger organisms in the planktonic community from being entrained. These 2 features, the low velocity and the mesh size, meet criteria and guidelines established by the National Marine Fisheries Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for protecting 2 types of listed species in the bay, juvenile salmonids and the longfin smelt. However, even with these protective features, the screens reduce overall entrainment of the full planktonic community by only about 1%, so the intake will draw in and kill a substantial number of the smaller organisms in the water column and create a measurable loss to the bay's productivity. Next slide, please. We determine the type and scope of this productivity loss by using methods the Commission and several other California resource agencies have used over the years. Excuse me. We first conduct a study to collect samples of the water body's marine life over the course of at least 1 year, and then evaluate those samples using a modeling technique known as the empirical transport model, or ETM. The model helps identify how many and what types of organisms in the water body that could be entrained, and then what proportion of that total would actually be entrained. This proportional mortality is then used to calculate what's called the area of production foregone, or APF, which identifies how many acres of habitat in the water body it would take to replace the lost productivity represented by the entrained marine life. The APF also serves as the basis for any resulting mitigation requirement. Importantly, even though most intakes take in just a very small proportion of all the entrainable marine life in a water body, that small proportion, when multiplied by the large size of the water body, can result in a substantial productivity loss and the need for compensatory mitigation. Next slide, please. For these calculations, we also had to incorporate the complex hydrodynamics of Humboldt Bay, which is pictured here. The district separated the bay into 4 segments, which are outlined here in different colors, based on factors such as the distance from the mouth of the bay, the speed and exchange rate of tidal currents, and others. The district's intakes are expected to entrain organisms from all parts of the bay, though at different rates depending on where they originated in the bay. Next slide, please. Importantly, the sampling, modeling, and calculations we rely on use just a select handful of the full number of species in the water body that are subject to entrainment. This is illustrated on this slide with the largest triangle represented the dozens or hundreds of species in a water body that could be entrained. The vast majority of these organisms are much smaller than the size of the screen mesh, and many of them were unable to identify at their early life stages. From this large number of organisms, the next smaller triangle shows just the larvae of fish and sometimes other important species such as crabs that can be entrained. Many, but not all that we can identify at this life stage. The next smaller triangle shows just those that are caught during sampling events and that can be identified, counted, and measured. Of those, just a handful, usually the predominant species in the samples, here represented by the top red triangle, are included in the calculations. These few species serve as surrogates for all the others in this biological system. The idea is that when a project's mitigation provides enough productivity to replace that represented by the handful of surrogate species, it is also producing enough to account for the many other species in the larger triangles that are lost due to entrainment. Next slide, please. For this project, there were 7 surrogate species as shown on this slide, each with its own APF. We average those APFs and then calculate the 95% certainty level. That is, we have 95% certainty that the loss of productivity caused by the intakes can be fully mitigated if the district creates or restores habitat that produces as much as 28.5 acres of typical Humboldt Bay habitats each year. I should note that in addition to these calculations, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is conducting a separate evaluation to identify how much and what type of mitigation would be needed to address the loss of the threatened longfin smelt, as some of those larvae would also be entrained. That study is still ongoing, but it is likely that all or some of the mitigation the district will need to provide for the smelt will also serve to mitigate for this overall entrainment impact. Next slide, please. To mitigate for this entrainment of marine organisms and the lost biological productivity, and to allow for conformity with the Coastal Act's mitigation-related provisions, the district and staff have developed a suite of different types of off-site mitigation around Humboldt Bay. I'll now turn this presentation back to Melissa to describe the mitigation approach.
Thanks very much, Tom. Next slide, please. One mitigation proposal involves the removal of nearly 1,000 derelict creosote-treated piles and associated crossbeams from an old dock and fields landing on the eastern shore of Humboldt Bay, south of Eureka. The removal of these derelict structures from the bay would increase the area of habitat in bay waters and make the underlying substrate available for colonization by marine life, therefore providing appropriate mitigation for lost productivity. Staff estimates that this site would provide about 0.8 acres of mitigation credit for lost productivity, assuming the commission credits the debris removal at no more than a 1-to-1 ratio, as has been its practice in past debris removal projects. Next slide. Another type of proposed mitigation is eradication of an invasive species from salt marsh habitats around Humboldt Bay. Spartina densiflora, seen here in the photo on the left, is an invasive grass native to Chile that dominates most of the salt marsh habitat within the region. The species profoundly alters estuarine habitats by increasing sedimentation, displacing native plant species, and disrupting habitats for fish and wildlife species. The removal of Spartina, if properly monitored and maintained, results in the return of native salt marsh habitat, including habitat for several rare species, such as the Humboldt Bay owl's clover, seen here flourishing in a restored marsh previously dominated by Spartina. In this case, staff recommends that an acre of salt marsh restoration within a high cover Spartina marsh could mitigate for 3.2 acres of APF due to the estimated productivity lift. A lesser credit would be appropriate for restoration in marshes with lower Spartina cover. Because the mitigation needed to adequately compensate for the APF is best represented by a variety of different habitat types, staff recommends capping this type of mitigation at no more than 15% of the mitigation needed for the total APF, or about 4.3 acres. Next slide. A third mitigation concept proposed by the district involves tidal marsh restoration on property that the district owns at the foot of Bay Street on Eureka Slough, which is connected to Humboldt Bay. Proposed activities include Spartina removal, backfilling man-made drainage ditches, and excavating new tidal channels and ponds, which will provide estuarine rearing habitat for marine resources, including juvenile salmonids and longfin smelt. Although the district's proposal remains conceptual at this stage, and this proposal will require separate CDP authorization from the commission, staff believes there are opportunities to provide between 7 and 11 acres of credit towards the total 28.5 acre APF. Because the area of tidal enhancement mitigation is expected to be more productive than the area of source water lost, staff recommends generally that mitigation involving the restoration of biogenically structured habitats such as seagrass beds and salt marshes should be credited up to 4 times the area of lost productivity associated with the intakes. This approach is consistent with the state's ocean plan, which recognizes that different types of mitigation provide different levels of productivity and in line with mitigation ratios the commission has applied in past cases. Next slide. The district has proposed several additional potential mitigation actions that could be appropriate for replacing lost productivity from Humboldt Bay, including the creation of restoration of aquatic habitats, restoration of marsh features, and the reclamation of or reconnection of historic plains, and additional marine debris removal. Additional mitigation activities like Bay Street and Spartina removal would require an amendment to this permit or separate CDP authorization. Staff recommends special condition 4 to require submittal of a final marine life mitigation plan prior to CDP issuance. The plan must include all necessary details sufficient to implement compensatory mitigation for no less than the impacts associated with phase 1 water extraction, which is about 12 acres and 43% of the total impacts. Planning for additional mitigation acreage associated with impacts for phases 2 and 3 could be provided subsequently, but would still be required for review and approval prior to any further extraction. Using the framework ratios provided in Special Condition 4, no less than about 7 acres of relatively more productive habitat than the habitat lost to the at the intake site would be realized to fully compensate for the 28.5 acre APF. This assumes the district maximizes the use of the highest available ratio of 1:4, which would reflect the restoration of highly productive biogenically structured habitats such as eelgrass or salt marsh. Next slide. Finally, I'll just note that after publication of the staff report, we received several comment letters posted to our website, and we've prepared an addendum to respond to those comments, also posted on our website. The addendum makes several corrections, clarifications, and revisions to the staff report, including certain changes to special conditions and an additional new condition to address the potential to encounter legacy contamination and portions of the project site that were used in the past for treating lumber using chemical spraying operations. Also, since publishing the addendum yesterday, staff realized a few more corrections that need to be made. So we do have a copy of some further changes that if we could ask this other item to be brought up. So if you could please scroll to page 9. These final changes are related to a calculation error and how the 15% threshold for Spartina removal would be implemented. And if you go to page 9, they're shown in track changes. In brief, the threshold specified in the condition sorry. Yeah, can you scroll to it's on page 9. Is it not showing? I'm sorry.
Oh, can you show track changes? Can you show track changes?
Oh, okay. Maybe it's just not showing. I had it.
Yeah, the second option. No.
I wonder if okay. Okay, I will describe, sorry. So the change, so there was a calculation error. And so the change on page 9 is at the bottom, and under, it's in There it is. Okay, so in the marine resources and water quality finding regarding tidal restoration and enhancement activities on pages 41 to 43, this additional change is related to the calculation the calculation error. There was a calculation error in how the 15% threshold for Spartina removal would be implemented. So this further change shown here is related to that. In brief, the threshold specified in the special condition 4, is based on the total APF acreage, but the interpretation and the findings mistakenly suggested the threshold would be based on the acreage over which mitigation would be implemented. So to ensure consistency between the condition and the findings, this change on page 9 is recommended, and then on the top of page 10, and then there's one more change on page 21. I know these are difficult to see, but we did share these changes with the applicant before showing them here, and the applicant has indicated their acceptance of these further changes. I need to read these further. Okay. So page 9, and then the other one is on page 21. So with that, staff recommends that the commission approve the coastal development permit with the special conditions and findings included in the staff recommendation as modified by the changes in the addendum. And this concludes our presentation.
Thanks,
and
Ms.
we're
Kramer.
available for questions. And I just want to mention also Dr. Garcia, our commission's ecologist, is also available for questions. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. Thanks very much. All right, returning to commission, ask if there are any ex partes. Commissioner Wilson.
I have two. They're both, I think, pretty minor. On Saturday, I was on the phone with Jennifer Calt, talking about other things, and she's with Humboldt Waterkeeper, and she mentioned that she had sent a letter in correspondence. We didn't discuss the details of it. She just let me know, but then we moved on to other things. So wanted to then actually on I was at a Cinco de Mayo party, and I ran into Jeff Anderson, who is a local hydrologist, and I didn't ask him. We had a very nerdy conversation about tidal prisms in Humboldt Bay and their function in climate change, and so we talked about dredging and also pumping seawater as part of that. And I didn't ask him if he was a consultant for the project. He wasn't. Okay, great. So I just wanted to make sure. We were geeking out on that, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. So thanks.
That sounds like such a fun party.
It was awesome.
Okay.
The guacamole was great.
Awesome. Any other ex partes? All right, seeing none, I'll open the public hearing and ask is the applicant have a presentation
We have no presentation, but we have a speaker, Rob Holmland.
on behalf of the applicant?
Yes.
All right. How much time will you need? 3 minutes. Fantastic.
So, yeah. So thank you for having me here. My name is Rob Holmland. I'm the Development Director for the Humboldt Bay Harbor Recreation Conservation District. I did prepare a lengthy PowerPoint with a lot of graphics, but after 3 years of working with your staff and agreeing with the staff recommendation, I decided to spare you with that, but we're available for questions. I do want to share with you just a little bit of background about the project site and the Harbor District. So the Harbor District was established in the 1970s through the California Harbors and Navigation Code to oversee all commerce, recreation, and conservation throughout Humboldt Bay. And every project we do, everything we do, we balance those 3 directives from the state. The site we're talking about is known as Redwood Marine Terminal. It was the largest employment center in the Humboldt Bay region for 3 consecutive generations. And then in the 2008 to 2013 era, it was closed. It had formerly been a pulp mill producing paper and wood products and included 2 bay water intake systems to provide water cooling and other purposes at the site. Upon its closure, the Harbor District did not own it. It was privately owned. And a couple of our commissioners, our elected commissioners, were informed by former employees that there were millions of gallons of toxic caustic liquors stored in tanks on site that required constant maintenance. And now that it was closed, those were not being maintained. So our commissioners were able to visit the site, saw that the valves on those tanks were corroding and crystallized, contacted the Environmental Protection Agency, and within days, the Environmental Protection Agency helped the Harbor District prioritize that site and remove the imminent threat to Humboldt Bay. Had that not been done, we would still be recovering from a major contamination event in Humboldt Bay. Once the imminent threat was contained, the Harbor District then worked with the EPA and a number of other parties to acquire the site and has been working to revitalize it since, immediately going into a visioning process. And the Harbor District entertained proposals from other pulp mills that wanted to do paper and wood product production at the site. But our Harbor District had the vision for this site to become an aquaculture innovation zone. And for the past 11 years, we have been working to implement that vision. So we have a number of tenants that are in water growing oysters and seaweed. They lease some of the remaining buildings on site. But the real vision requires upland aquaculture facilities to fulfill the vision. And Nordic Aqua Farms has come forward as a great partner for the Harbor District to be the anchor tenant at that upland part of the aquaculture innovation zone. And in order to do upland aquaculture, we need to revitalize and modernize the intake system. A lot of studies and science have gone into this, and a lot of strategies to reduce, eliminate impacts, working with your staff, whom, by the way, have been phenomenal to work with and really deserve a lot of credit, incredible scientists and professionals. So we've got, in conclusion here, 3 things that we are using to eliminate or reduce impacts. One is the screen design. So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, the diameter of the holes through which the water passes is smaller than the hole in a letter O on a piece of paper in front of you. So that is how small the screen size is. Second is the velocity of the water. Right now, at 0.2 feet per second or less is the through screen velocity. If you were to travel at 0.2 feet per second from that wall to that wall, it takes 6.5 minutes. Just for context, the tidal exchange of the bay can be up to 5 feet per second, which would take 15 seconds to go from that wall to that wall. So the through screen velocity is very slow. The screen size is very small. We also have phasing, and then for those impacts that we do have, your staff described the mitigation. So we are very close. Within the next 3 weeks, we anticipate finishing our permitting process with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, National Marine Fisheries Service, and then the Water Board. So we anticipate within the next 8 to 9 weeks, we'll be finished with all of our permits, and some of those other agencies are actually waiting on your action. So available for questions if you have any. We also have several scientists and representatives of Nordic Aqua Farms here with us if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. You know, I do have one question just to stop you from coming right back up. And I know this is probably a stupid question because I don't have any knowledge at all of how this works. But so when things are, so you have the intake, is there ever a time where the intake is turned off or to release what has potentially been however you want to call it? They're not necessarily in train, but they're still stuck essentially on the outside of. What happens to that situation?
Sure. So I think what you're describing is called impingement. So there
There's
are
so much. That's a better
two
term.
things that
then.
can happen to organisms with an intake system. One is they can be impinged up against the screen, so they're just stuck against the screen, and the other is entrained. Our system is designed so that there is no impingement. The through velocity of the screens is too slow, so even the smallest organism would not get impinged against the screen. No impingement. So I think the answer to your question is there is no answer, that there is no impingement. Maybe to build on it a little bit, there are 2 intakes that work together, and it is likely that one of them will be shut down for maintenance while the other is operating, and then the inverse. But it is unlikely that both of them will be shut down for long extended periods of time, because the water that we are providing to our tenants, including Nordic, are raising animals.
It has to
And
keep
so
going.
the system has to continually operate.
Okay, that helps clarify that question. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions right now for Mr. Holman? Yes, Commissioner Cummings.
Chair Hart, I think we should
You
finish
want
the
to
public
do,
comment.
I was just
please.
thinking of him coming up, down,
I
but
hear
if
you.
you'd prefer.
Yes,
I-
thanks.
I always, sorry, I'll have to come back to you. Thank you very much. All right, in that case, I'll open up the item for additional speakers or for speakers in response to what's been presented. How many speakers do we have?
Okay, so we have 9 speakers for this item.
All right,
First, we'll start with one person in person, David Noyes.
all right. So is 2 minutes sufficient?
Yes, 2 minutes should
Okay,
be sufficient.
thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Hart and Commissioners. My name is David Noyce. I'm Nordic Aqua Farms Senior Vice President of U.S. Strategic Projects. Nordic Aqua Farms undertook a search that stretched from Vancouver to Southern California when looking for a West Coast site. The Samoa Peninsula's existing infrastructure made it stand out as the clear choice for us. The Harbor District is our landlord, and in the instance of these sea chests acting in the same capacity as a municipal water district delivering metered water to our facility. Nordic has asked the Harbor District to reduce and avoid impacts through 2 simple mechanisms. The first is to phase withdrawal of the seawater to match the timeline of users' needs. The second was to seek an engineering solution that would reduce impacts. The intake screens will exceed the standard of 1.75 millimeters as described in Section D1B of the National Marine Fisheries Service screening criteria for juvenile salmonids. We concur with Tenera's opinion that the modernized screens will significantly reduce impacts to fishing crabs by surpassing these standards. We also feel that reusing existing infrastructure avoids the impacts that would be associated with building new marine infrastructure. These sea chests and other pre-permitting activities the Harbor District have undertaken over the years remove significant barriers for aquaculture, innovation, and research. We feel strongly that aquaculture research and innovation should be supported and encouraged in California. It should also be noted that a component of this project is a fire suppression line along the shoreline. Last, but certainly not least, I want to thank and commend the members of your staff for their efforts and professionalism when reviewing the extensive amount of technical information this application has produced. I humbly request that you adopt your staff's recommendation for approval. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. And we have 8 speakers on Zoom. We're starting with Frank Egger, followed by Susan Kirks, and then Luke Gardner.
Thank you. Each
Right.
speaker will have 2 minutes.
Frank Egger.
Thank you. Frank Ager, representing the North Coast Rivers Alliance. I had sent in comments. I'll be brief. The purpose of Proposition 20 and the Coastal Act of 1976 is to preserve, protect, and restore coastal resources. The Humboldt Bay Harbor District's application to withdraw 11+ million gallons a day of seawater to supply the factory fish farm will cause significant adverse impacts on our fisheries. This application has been piecemeal through the California Environmental Quality Act process in direct violation of CEQA. The entrainment issue is huge. Sea level rise and future tsunami impacts must be addressed. The California Pacific Ocean salmon season is shut down again the 2nd year in a row. The North Coast Rivers Alliance is an intervener in the Fort Ross Ocean Hydro Project on the Sonoma coast. Entrainment was one of our issues we raised. That resulted in the denial by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission of that application. For this application, the condition that Department of Fish and Wildlife must approve a take permit under the Endangered Species Act to kill coho salmon is the red flag. All wastewater coming out of that factory fish farm must be cleansed using reverse osmosis before being discharged into the ocean. Everyone is now aware of the litigation against the city and county of San Francisco for a decade of untreated wastewater being dumped into San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. No pesticides should be used to remove Spartina. Please continue this application until you can be assured that no take permit to kill coho will be necessary. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Susan Kirks, followed by Luke Gardner, and then Jennifer Colt. Susan Kirks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, commissioners and staff. I'm Susan Kirks. President of Madrone Audubon in Sonoma County. I'd like to support what former Coastal Commissioner Frank Egger just said, every single word of it. The condition of our native fish populations, the climate change impacts that we are all dealing with and that you must address now in every decision, the piecemealing of this project violating CEQA, including not evaluating cumulative impacts. Also, Scott Fraser's correspondence submitted to you is detailed, informative, and an added basis for denying this intake project before you today. Mitigations proposed for the impacts of entrainment and losses are wholly inadequate. If species had a voice, do you think they would say to you, yes, commissioners, we want to be sucked into this pipe and die? I urge you to review carefully the information from California Department of Fish and Wildlife and conceptual bases for trying to figure out how many species will be sucked into the pipe and die. There is no difference between this proposal and putting thousands of cows or thousands of female pigs in gestation crates unable to turn around in a concentrated animal feeding operation. The kind of jobs this concentrated animal feeding operation creates are terrible and produce human trauma as well. I encourage the Humboldt County decision makers to return to the drawing board and consider better fit for job creation and projects in that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, Luke Gardner, followed by Jennifer Colt and Allison Lilly. Luke Gardner.
Thank you, Chair Hart, commissioners and staff for the opportunity to speak. I represent California Sea Grant. California Sea Grant would like to express our support for the redevelopment of seawater intake systems to support the development of the Harbor District Initiative, the National Marine Research and Innovation Park. California Sea Grant has identified the development of research and commercial parks such as that proposed by the Humboldt Bay Harbor District as being important to providing equitable access for communities to participate in coastal dependent activities like marine aquaculture by helping to reduce the regulatory barriers to entry. We found the development of such parks elsewhere in the country and abroad have proven to be effective catalysts for economic development, as well as building marine research capacity. The development of Humboldt Bay Harbor District's park aligns with strategic focus areas of California Sea Grant being sustainable fisheries and aquaculture and resilient coastal communities and economies. With an expanding aquaculture industry looking to create a steady supply of shellfish, seaweeds, and finfish in California, the development of this park and its seawater access will support aquaculture research, extension, and outreach to ensure that farming seafood is environmentally, economically, and socially more sustainable and resilient to future change. Furthermore, we believe the development of this park will provide a key resource for the development and testing of both conservation and restoration aquaculture practices in the region. In summary, California Sea Grant supports the Humboldt Bay Harbor District's application to redevelop their seawater intakes for the purposes of developing their proposed park. The development of this park will provide more equitable access to aquaculture for local communities for commercial restoration and research purposes and ensure that coastal dependent activities are continued in this area. This application very much aligns with our California Sea Grant strategic vision of resilient, thriving coastal and marine environments and ecosystems. And as such, we encourage the Coastal Commission to approve the application.
Thank you. Next, Jennifer Colt, followed by Allison Lilly and Scott Fraser. Jennifer Colt.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Jennifer Kalt. I'm the Executive Director of Humboldt Waterkeeper in Arcata. I'm sorry I was not able to be in Crescent City in person today, but I'm really grateful to be able to participate remotely. I especially wish I could join you on your field trip to Pacific Shores. You're in for a real treat. And I want to say thank you to the Commission and Sandra Jerebeck, Patty McCleary, and everyone else who's worked for decades to protect Pacific Shores because it is really a remarkable place. Humboldt Waterkeeper strongly supports the revisions to Condition 6 and new Special Condition 13 in the Addendum, which address legacy contamination in the path of the proposed pipeline trench for this project. The trench will be over 4,600 feet long, 19 feet wide, and 5 feet deep, and will traverse sites of former lumber mills, plywood mills, and the former pulp mill that Rob Homeland spoke about. There are several known areas of contamination that have not been cleaned up, and there are also many areas that have not been assessed, despite the fact that these mills have been dismantled for decades. These parcels are also the site of the proposed heavy lift terminal for offshore wind energy and will need to be fully assessed and remediated before that project can move forward. In the meantime, because of the pipeline route's proximity to Humboldt Bay, ground disturbance without these conditions would put the bay and human health at risk from dioxins, PCBs, and other toxic chemicals that were used carelessly throughout the 20th century and remain in soil and groundwater on site. We would like to thank the staff for incorporating our concerns into these conditions, as well as the applicant and especially Nordic Aqua Farms for recognizing the importance of protecting Humboldt Bay from legacy contamination. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Allison Willie, Scott Frazier, and Control, and then our last speaker will be Nancy Okada. Allison Willie.
Thank you, Chairperson Hart and Commissioners, for this opportunity to speak. My name is Allison Willie. I have a 45-year career in fisheries and environmental policy and have actively participated in environmental review of the Nordic Aqua Farms project. First of all, thank you to your staff for including clarifying language on the National Marine Fisheries Service Endangered Species Act consultation on the saltwater intakes. Throughout this environmental review, I have been concerned about the massive carbon footprint of the project, the threat of significant eutrophication in Humboldt Bay when a marine upwelling event occurs in an incoming tide, and the unavoidable threat of well-known fish farm diseases being released into migratory habitat for wild salmon and trout. I understand that you are powerless to address the carbon footprint issue on this project, and we all have to take our chances with marine upwelling and redistribution of sewage solids. But where you can do something is by reducing the risk of spread of infectious pancreatic necrosis virus, IPNV, and other fish farm diseases into the marine environment. IPNV is an RNA virus that can and will easily elude Nordic's proposed treatment of effluvial discharge. For more information on IPNV, reports, risk, and many images of dying and decaying fish can be seen by Googling this disease, which is an outstanding problem for kingfish yellowtail farming. Nordic plans to treat the intake water with ozone to protect fish in the factory, but not to treat the effluvia with the same level of protection for native wild fish. Nordic plans, I have advocated strenuously for there to be ozone treatment of the wastewater and for addressing the project as a whole, allowing the National Marine Fisheries to determine the risk to endangered salmonids from fish farm diseases. I can't find any commitment by the Commission to address the infectious disease problem in the Marine Life Mitigation Plan, or any commitment to work with NIMS on the disease issue. Please add measures that will protect wild salmon from IPNV.
Thank you. Next, Scott Frazier. I see that you're on the phone. Please unmute.
Thank you. Is the audio working?
Yes, we can hear you.
Chairperson Hart, Commissioners, my name is Scott Frazier. I have 44 years of professional experience as a biologist working for natural resource agencies. The subject CDP is complex, as the presentation by your staff just made a beautiful example, but has also been piecemealed in evaluation of impacts. The applicant has submitted incomplete applications twice. This requires added and unnecessary repetitive work time from your staff. The current submittal did not include adequate mitigation for the substantial and significant losses of biological productivity that will occur. Therefore, it appears your staff has attempted to help them complete the CDP package. Impacts of entrainment of saltwater intakes are unacceptable. The mitigation presented in special condition number 4 is only conceptual at this time, as described by your staff. Rather than accept the losses of marine life and uncertain mitigation, avoidance should be adopted by moving the intakes offshore. It's amazing that we can accommodate the construction and all the other impacts of this project, but we can't accommodate moving the saltwater intake offshore, as would be in compliance with National Marine Fisheries Service 1997 guidelines, which were addressed in the final project impact EIR in Appendix R. Please do not approve the subject CDP today. Rather, direct the applicant to submit a complete, specific, and adequate mitigation plan, or move the intakes offshore before you consider approval. Otherwise, your staff's time will be sucked up into a back and forth with this applicant and the conditions that are necessary for a reasonable project. Please see my more extensive written comments, which were submitted to you on Friday. Thank you.
Thank you. And Cantrell?
Good afternoon. Ann Cantrell, Sierra Club Los Cerritos Wetlands Task Force. We oppose this proposed fish farm and urge you to deny this request to withdraw up to 11.88 million gallons per day of estuarine bay water to support aquaculture and other coastal dependent uses. Of most concern is the entrainment of eggs, larvae, and fry of not only listed, but all fish using the bay as a nursery. Although the latest condition requires the entrapment mesh to be smaller, eggs and plankton can still be destroyed. With this plan, any living thing which is drawn through the mesh will be used to support aquaculture while the rest of the bay starves. Remember why power plants, once through cooling, is being eliminated in California. This same process of pumping seawater has been found to kill all the life in the wetlands. This is one of the reasons why the fishing industry has collapsed off the Southern California coast. Staff stated that the water withdrawal will have adverse impact on marine life and loss to the bay's productivity and requires mitigation. Some of these mitigation issues are good. Removal of the derelict piling should occur whether this project goes through or not. The Bay Street tidal enhancement mitigation is very questionable, and I suggest that if this mitigation is used, it should be completed before the project is done. Please either deny or delay this decision. Thank you.
Thank you. And then our last speaker for this item is Nancy Okada. Nancy, when you're able to, please unmute yourself. You're momentarily unmuted. Okay, there you go.
All right, I'm unmuted now. Hello, you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Sorry about that. Okay, great. Nancy Okada, Sierra Club California Coastal Subcommittee. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you for allowing us to have a comment. This project is actually, this is a huge, huge project that's come before you, and this is part 3 of the pieces that you've been seeing over the months. And I know that there's been concern expressed earlier on, and they said, well, wait until next month and wait until next month. So this is the last piece. And we're concerned that there's really too many moving parts and that all the permits are not in, and it really needs to be continued. You need to have everything in place. You need to know all the details about the different studies that are not yet complete. You need to know that have the entrainment measurements set. You need to have the mitigation outlined in detail. You need to have the outtake possibly moved offshore, because that would make a whole lot more sense than bringing in it directly out of the bay, and you wouldn't take in as many fish. Now, I understand that may be too expensive for the applicant, but that is something that it would be environmentally better for the whole project. So we would ask that you delay this project and get everything together and then bring it back to the public. This is important to the entire community, not only for jobs and the economy, but for the economic and environmental health of the community, and that includes your fishermen offshore. This is very, very important, and you should wait and bring it back again when everything is together. Thank you very much.
That concludes public comment. All right, thank you very much. All right, returning to Mr. Holman, do you have any other further comments? Where did he go? There you are. I thought that was you. No comments. All right. And returning back to staff, anything further? Ms. Kramer?
We could just respond to a few of the comments that were raised. Most of what we heard in public comment, we did address in the addendum, but I'll just mention a few things. A comment that was concerned about the release of viruses into the environment. The commission considered those when it considered the discharge permit last November and the monitoring that's required on that permit and the water quality protections there. So that's not really at issue today. And with respect to the alternatives that people are suggesting, in the staff report and in the county's EIR for the Nordic project, there was a lengthy discussion of alternatives, and subsurface alternatives were found to be infeasible, or found that they would not reduce the impacts. Other types of intakes were found also to be not feasible. So this is all addressed in the addendum and in the findings. And in terms of mitigation, we've determined that the district does have sufficient mitigation opportunities available at this time to fully mitigate for the phase 1 portion of the project. And as mentioned, much of the mitigation will require separate CDP authorization, so you'll get to review that. I'm not sure if we want to respond to the piecemealing questions.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, this came up again after it already came up in the December 2023 hearing when the commission denied the appeal, found no substantial issue for the actual aquaculture facility. So that was December 2023. And again, the county, prepared and certified a final EIR and evaluated the full scope of the projects, all three, what appellants are calling segments of the project. So the full impacts of, all three pieces have been evaluated. So we don't think there is a piecemealing argument to be made in responsible agencies, which is the commission in this context. We're not a lead agency. The county was the lead agency. Responsible agencies have to use, are kind of confined by what is in the proposed in the EIR. So we're relying on the EIR for the scope of the project. And so there, to my knowledge, there's no case law that actually finds a responsible agency liable or found that a responsibility agency has violated CEQA for under piecemealing theories. It's typically the lead agency that has that duty to ensure they evaluate the full scope of the project and all impacts. So there shouldn't be an issue with piecemealing.
All right, thanks so much. Is that complete comments by staff? All right, thanks, Ms. Kramer. Bring it back to Commission. I know Commissioner Cummings, you had a question earlier. And was that going to be for Mr. Holman or just in general? Yes, Mr. Holman.
I was just curious about compared to the pulp mill, speak to the difference.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I don't have exact numbers for you. I can say with relative confidence that the infrastructure that we are retrofitting didn't have screens of this size or design. They were effectively flat screens that would have facilitated, but probably if you were to seek a way to design for impingement, that would have been the best way to do it. So the system previously probably had incredible amounts of impingement and entrainment. This new system is the best available technology to minimize or eliminate both of those things. Does that answer your question?
I guess the next question, wanted to speak to the mitigation. How important is going to be done? There's some, well, I'm curious about, in terms of the restoration of the mitigation of some of the sites and not some also, other benefits since there hasn't been this intake hasn't been occurring at the site for quite some time. There's trying to evaluate how once it's
Yep. I'm happy to try to answer that question, though I may defer to your staff, but I believe we're going to be working with your staff over the course of the next several months to determine those details precisely. But the Harbor District is mandated by the state to implement conservation throughout Humboldt Bay. So we have a lot of experience with this in restoration, conservation, mitigation projects, and work closely with the Coastal Commission staff on a regular basis to implement those and to implement monitoring systems. Does that answer your question sufficiently? Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Any other commissioners? I know Commissioner Wilson has some questions. Anyone on this end? Okay, Commissioner Nodoff, then we'll come back to you. Commissioner Wilson will go last and then we'll.
First, I wanted to just compliment the staff on the extensive addendum and responsiveness to the comments. So a number of the questions that I had written down after reading the correspondence on this have been addressed in the addendum. So I wanted to point that out. I think there's one of the comments that did stick out for me was the request that we consider reverse osmosis on the effluent. And so is that taken care of in the last permit? I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about reverse osmosis.
I believe that is associated with the treatment system that was approved under the county's permit for the Nordic Aqua Farms permit. The Nordic might be able to speak better to that, but that isn't something that is before us today associated with the intakes as far as I'm aware.
And in terms of looking at these different projects, I too had been concerned that we were looking at them in separate motions, but I do think that the staff has been consistent through all of those. So there has been a cumulative analysis that's been applied to each one of these. And I guess the other thing I just wanted to clarify is the sequence of the permit process. So it's before the Coastal Commission now, but the Department of Fish and Wildlife needs to issue a permit and the Water Board. Could you just explain that a little bit to us?
Yes, prior to permit issuance, the CDP, the applicant has to provide permits from the Water Board and CDFW. And any changes required by those other agencies would require an amendment to this permit if needed. The Water Board has partially taken action already. They issued an NPDES permit that covered the intakes, the discharge, So that action is complete. There's a 401 certification that is in process, but it should be along shortly, I believe. And the CDFW incidental take permit is also in process. As to why we went before them, I think it's just how the timing came up, but we've been working really closely with CDFW staff on the mitigation concepts and throughout our permit review.
So I note in the correspondence that there's been a lot of back and forth with Fish and Wildlife. So
yeah.
there's no surprises there. I do think that it's important to acknowledge the dire straits that the wild salmon fishery is in, and the kind of dramatic regulatory measures that the state of California and the federal government are having to do, considering the dire straits of that fishery. So we need to be extra careful that we're not adding to the stress of that wild population. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else on this end? Commissioner Geary.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know who to direct this question to, but did the area of production foregone model account for environmental factors related to climate change?
Tom can
Sure,
answer this.
I'll
Go
take
ahead.
that. Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, the entrainment study we do develops what's called the proportional mortality, the percentage of organisms in the water body that actually get entrained. Plankton populations vary every year, up and down by quite a bit. It's a very patchy sort of dynamic. And so unless there are huge changes in the biological community, the results from 1 year are expected to be about the same as what you might get in a different year with a different concentration of plankton. So in that sense, the usual annual variability in populations is reflected in the way we do these studies. For longer term changes that are due to climate change, that may be an issue in the future. If there are complete shifts in the biological community, that may be something to address down the road. But for the standard annual variations we see, the study we do is supposed to incorporate those.
Thank you for that. And yes, we know that there's variability from year to year, from decade to decade, right? But I would strongly encourage us to figure out ways to monitor for that, given the rapid changing conditions and unpredictable variability that we're seeing. I think it's important to take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Wilson?
I have a couple questions and some statements. So the first one just has to do with, so much of this is measured off of volume. I mean, this is what we're talking about, in terms of impact, is like the volume of water and what's in that volume of water or what's being removed. So at 10 million gallons a day, what is that in comparison to the total tidal exchange in Humboldt Bay in a day?
Forgive me that I don't recall the exact numbers, but Humboldt Bay contains about 40 billion gallons, and over the 40 billion gallons,
billion, 40 billion
with
gallons.
a B. And over the course of any 6-hour period from high tide to low tide, 20 billion gallons leave the bay, and then 20 billion come back. So the 12 million gallons that we are withdrawing is about 1/6,000th of the total volume of water that is exchanged in any given tidal exchange. And just for context, if you were to compare that in time, that is the equivalent of 1 day versus 16 years. So that's the equivalent difference of 1/6,000th of any given tidal exchange. So it's not 1/6,000th of the water in the bay.
Right.
That's 1/6,000th of the water that was leaving the bay anyway, and then coming back and leaving again.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I'm going to bounce around. Has anyone ever seen my notes before? They're really all over the place, and and they're hard to read even for myself, and they have all kinds of sketches in them. But I want to, it's interesting that we have often referred to projects having charismatic megafauna, and I think in this point we have uncharismatic microfauna is our issue that we're talking about, and sort of, and if this is approved, what we're talking about is trying to replicate and mitigate the productivity of what we might expect in that that volume of water. As Mr. Lester was Lester was saying, is that, you know, that and our staff was that, you know, it's like different parts of the bay produce biomass at different rates, and so where you draw from and where you actually create is of value. So, and this is something that, I mean, I was elected to this harbor district in 2005. I was elected to this board on a platform of estuarine restoration and for all the values that it has. And so for me, and I have to just going way back, that came from my experiences in traveling, actually visiting my now wife in the Peace Corps and mangrove restoration, and seeing what estuarine restoration really can do. And it's volumetric, it's exponential value in the ecosystems. And so for me, I mean, mitigation that includes estuarine restoration, and especially that includes maximizing that volume and maximizing the vertical structure within that volume to create those values is really very important. I'm going to noodle down because this is what I was talking about with my good friend Mr. Anderson, which is that Humboldt Bay has been volume limited in some regards by the diking and dredging, and so anything that we've been doing to increase what we call the tidal prism, which is that volume in there, does so many things to benefit the bay. And so so every time we open up more space, just more volume comes through the entrance of the bay. So one of the discussions I had with Tom was if we're having a negative impact from this pulling of volume from the bay, would we in turn get a positive impact, say, by creating volume, both either from restoration, but even from dredging, right? Because you're creating more volume, so you're creating more water exchange coming in the bay. Of course, it's a very uncomfortable conversation to think about that there might be a positive benefit to pulling water from the bay. But one of the things that we're talking about in terms of climate change, and this is something that Mr. Anderson was bringing up to me, which is very interesting, was that the future of Humboldt Bay could be under warmer conditions, in which case we actually want to increase volume of water coming into Humboldt Bay to keep it cooler, right? To cool it down. So we really do need to think about that in terms of both our mitigations and our impacts. And so I just want to when we talk about volume, it's not just about what's in the volume, it's where it comes from, but it's also its function and sort of the greater what we're talking about. Jumping to, we did talk about, and I know we're not talking necessarily before us today, but the treatment for the proposed aquaculture. And again, what we're talking about today is a permit for the district to pull water for a multi-tenant project. So that's separate from the tenant that might be at this point driving the economics of moving that forward. But the idea is that there would be more tenants. I mean, this volume and this permit isn't just for one tenant. Ostensibly, it's for multiple tenants. And so going back to they have a ultraviolet disinfection system is what they're proposing. We've talked about it here. We talked about it also at the permit process for the county. Nothing more effective to remove viruses than an ultraviolet disinfection system. And again, the most highly treated effluent from any aquaculture farm on the planet is probably what will result from that. So jumping again, and I think we've mentioned this before, aside from all of the external or sort of like, and we had someone comment about, it's not just about this aquaculture project, it's also about marine research to be done on site. It's about, there's a whole host of other benefits that could come, assuming this is something that happens. But one of them is, and what we learned from our existing aquaculture industry in Humboldt Bay, is that unlike the pulp mill, which was pulling water from the bay, they didn't really necessarily care about the water quality of what they were pulling from the bay because they weren't using it for anything in particular other than to cool down this giant boiler system for basically processing pulp. This particular businesses and all the businesses that be using this water care very much about the water quality of the bay. They're absolutely reliant upon that. And as we've seen in Humboldt Bay, the reason that there's not an effluent pipe in Humboldt Bay as opposed to out into the ocean is because oyster growers, and one in particular, sued and was very influential in 1964, forcing the pulp mills to put their effluent out into the ocean. Had he not done that, our bay would have been dead long ago. So there is a driver for clean water in industries that require clean water. And if you want to protect things like eelgrass, the driving threat to eelgrass is water quality, right? That is really one of the things. And it's the same threat that is in existence for what we have for our oyster farms and other things like that. Water quality is really, that's the deal. Likewise, the businesses that would rely on this intake would rely on clean water. And so from that perspective, it's a driver in the direction. When we talk about the industries that we want or those types of things that we're trying to move towards, we want that symbiotic relationship to exist. And so for me, that is one of the reasons why I get where this is going. But also, I really want to encourage, if the board decides to move forward with this, I still want staff to be pushing really hard on the mitigation for this to maximize, again, productivity and volumetric productivity as we move forward. And I know you see there's those resources. This gets me to one question now that I'm just going through my stream of consciousness, going all over the place. But in regards to the longfin smelt, what I'm hearing you say, and I think what I read in here too, is that the likely mitigation for that could occur within the bounds of what would already be a likely mitigation footprint. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah, speaking with CDFW, they do believe that there are opportunities to mitigate for longfin smelt at the Bay Street tidal restoration site, because the smelt are known to occur in Eureka Slough. And so they could create habitat that would provide rearing opportunities for longfin smelt. And we believe that not only would provide those the habitat for the smelt, but for other, for salmonids, juvenile salmonids, and other marine resources that are expected to be, impacted by the APF or by the intake impact, impacts there. So yes, and then just to your point about the encouraging that type of mitigation, the increasing the volume of the bay, essentially, we in our condition 4 recommended mitigation ratios, we do suggest that a higher mitigation credit could be given for that type of mitigation as opposed to like the pilene removal or Spartina removal. So
I appreciate that. And again, kind of going back to a little bit of the history, I was chair of the commission at the time when we discovered 4 million gallons of pH 14, I think. What would they call black liquors, which was basically something that is used to break down chemicals, highly toxic chemicals, caustic chemicals used to break down wood fibers in tanks on that property, with the tops of those tanks having been almost fully exposed. And when the rain was coming, they were starting to leak over the tops. And if there had been, an earthquake or something like that, it would have just been an absolute disaster. It was a very stressful time for the district to take on a project like that. But it was done with the vision of imagining what we might have in that place to actually bring economic benefits and help clean up the environment. So this, for me, helps kind of like we're moving in that direction. I will say it doesn't come without impacts, and some of that was referenced, especially around, it will require energy to do it. Our food systems all require energy, and we need to reduce our, everywhere we can reduce our energy consumption, but that also means in terms of our food systems as well. And there are discussions about how this balances between imported seafood as opposed to seafood we produce ourselves, because fresh seafood is, much of it is, flown into our country and has a high footprint, but also there's other things that we have to consider. And if we're having some impact in terms of bioproductivity, we have to figure out the best way we can to mitigate for that. I feel like this has gotten to that place for me. And so that's where I'm at. And I appreciate the discussion and the board letting me kind of go down my road. Thanks.
No, I think it's super, I think it's really great for us to hear, because you've been involved with this for so long as a harbor commissioner, as a county supervisor, now as a coastal commissioner. So I think we all really appreciate your comments. So if no one has any more comments, I'm looking for a motion and a second. Commissioner Rice?
I'd like to second after.
I don't believe he wanted to move, so.
Okay, I would be happy to move the item, and I do have a comment.
All right. Commissioner Cummings, would you like to second?
Sure, I'll second. I was going to make a comment as well,
Sure.
but-
Why don't I, Commissioner Rice?
Yeah, no, I
your
just,
comment?
I appreciate the work by staff, the presentation, and all the questions that were asked by the commissioners and the responses that were given to the public. And I also really do appreciate also Commissioner Wilson allowing us to journey down your river of interior monologue and all the experience that came with it. All that was missing was Mr. Anderson and a margarita.
And
But
guacamole.
I just, I appreciate the work that's gone into this, and then the ongoing work that's going to have to happen. But understanding this larger complex environment is really important, even as we focus on one specific permit and aspect of a larger project. And I really do appreciate your love of this, that incredible bay.
Yeah. Commissioner Cummings, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just brief.
Yes, we have a motion and a second. They're.
No, we actually need to get the motion on the table.
All right. Why don't we have your comment, then we'll return to Commissioner Rice to make the full motion.
Yeah, I just want to appreciate the staff and the applicants for all the hard work that they've done. I know we've had this come before us in various iterations at different points in time, and I feel like what's been consistently demonstrated is really an ability to try to figure out how to allow us to move forward with having the least amount of environmental impacts as possible. And in addition to that, putting forward an environmental monitoring strategy that will really allow us to better understand how these types of operations can exist alongside of, maintaining biodiversity and having little impacts on our environments. I think to Commissioner Wilson's point, and some of the comments that we've made previously around, traditional commercial fishing practices, I mean, a lot of what we see is high levels of bycatch and, over time depletion of fish within our environments. And this is another form. It's going to have some impacts, but it can also help provide that protein food source for communities without having even further detrimental impacts on our natural environment. And so I think that, and a lot of comments that were raised around, monitoring and also bringing into factors of climate change totally makes sense. How it intersects with other forms of industry, well, not really industry, but other forms of activities around like dredging. I think these are all things that we can begin to better understand so that as we, start moving forward as a society and start adapting to the realities around us, around protecting our environment, impacts of climate change, and how do we continue to feed people, it's an opportunity for us to really see how this as a project really works out. And so I'm looking forward to really seeing how this moves forward. I know that there's going to be a lot of eyes and attention on this because people are going to be, probably coming at it, trying to shut it down. And so I think there's interest on the sides of the applicants, on the sides of the commission, and on the sides of our community to really see this, move forward and be productive and see it actually be successful. And so I'm happy to support it as I've supported in the past, and look forward to getting updates and hearing how this goes as the project comes online.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Rice.
Yes, I move that the commission approve coastal development permit application number 1-21-0653 pursuant to the staff recommendation, asking for a yes vote.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion, a second. Vanessa?
Commissioner Escalante,
Yes.
Escalante, yes. Commissioner Herman,
Yes.
Herman, yes. Commissioner Nada,
Aye.
Nada, yes. Commissioner Rice,
Yes.
Rice, yes. Commissioner Wilson,
Yes.
Wilson, yes. Commissioner Aguirre, Aguirre, yes. Commissioner Bajko,
Yes.
Bajko, yes. Commissioner Cummings,
Aye.
Cummings, yes. Chair Hart,
Yes.
Hart, yes. The vote is unanimous.